So listen to this. By the time Luis Diaz left Liverpool, he was earning £55,000 per week. Now, that may sound like a lot to you and me, but forget the fact it was 8 times less than what Salah and Van Dijk were getting, because aside from their academy players, only Wataru Endo, who had only played 800 minutes all season, was being paid less than Diaz. However, even after a year pleading for a proper renewal, they rejected it, so Bayern Munich pounced on a chance to sign him like a hyena. For future reference, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. If you're ever negotiating with Bayern Munich and they give in to every single demand you make within just 2 weeks, even though they have supposedly just lost out on their main transfer target to you, there's about a 99% chance you're about to make a massive mistake. That's how Arne Slot went from being Klopp's disciple to becoming the face of Liverpool's collapse in less than a year. But what makes this all the more embarrassing for Arne Slot is that he cannot complain that he wasn't warned. I'm not even talking about the dozens of journalists who instantly jumped out of their seats after hearing that they were about to let go of one of their main match winners in order to bankroll part of a £500 million gamble. I'm talking about Klopp, because if you pay attention to how he handled Diaz, you can tell he was never meant to be just a temporary signing to bridge the gap between Mane, Firmino and whoever came next. Klopp always knew he had infinite potential, and I'm sure he's not surprised that Diaz has had more goal contributions in 1 year at Bayern than he had for 3 seasons under his management. The signs were always there. Look, this isn't just a usual story about how coming up in South America is worlds away from coming up in some bleeding-edge Premier League academy. No, even within Colombia, Luis Diaz pulled a short straw. He is a member of the Wayu, an indigenous people from the northernmost corner of Colombia who, unlike the others, not only learned how to use their colonizers' guns, but rebelled against them, burning their churches, kidnapping their priests, and remaining as one of the few ethnic groups the Spanish were never able to conquer. However, they did get punished for it. Over the next 3 centuries, they watched as every other tribe got absorbed into the colonial state, while they became a frontier zone. Forgotten by their own governments, even to this day, it is estimated that at least 5,000 Wayu children suffer from malnutrition, and Luis Diaz was one of them. As you may imagine, being raised in a traditional Wayu house with walls made of clay, it was only at 11 when he got his first TV and some bootleg Ronaldinho DVDs, so to even dream of a chance at a proper academy was out of the question, until at 17, one of his uncles decided to drive him for 6 hours all the way to an open trial at Atletico Junior. There were 3,000 kids there that day, and despite Diaz being one of the oldest, he was also the skinniest. In the words of one of the coaches, he looked like 5 pipe cleaners rigged together with duct tape. He was 17, but he had the body of a 12-year-old. Still, no matter how many said it was too late for him, that coach decided to vouch for Diaz, and though they mocked him for how unrefined his game was, joking that he'd always dribble with his head down, so unaware of his surroundings that he'd often run out of the pitch altogether, then, back in his hometown, all funded by a raffle, his people gathered enough money to send a team all the way out to Chile to play in the South American Cup for Indigenous people, and there, someone saw him differently from the rest. Serving as an advisor to the team, the legendary Carlos Valderrama not only felt he had found an hidden gem, but he instructed the management to move Diaz, who up till then had been playing as a striker, into the left wing, and the result immediately came as he scored a free kick to beat Argentina, then inspired a 3-0 win over the hosts to lead Colombia to the final, and even though there he'd break into tears after a defeat to Paraguay, that tournament had changed his life. Upon his return, he was informed that thanks to Valderrama, he'd be sent to Junior satellite club Barranquilla to start his senior career. Yes, they were throwing him to the wolves, but it was in his blood to never back down. Within a year, having finally been put on a proper diet, Diaz had gained 10 kilos, been called up to Colombia's under-20s, and after going up against Atletico Junior themselves in the Colombian Cup, he ran through his own parent club, holding them to a draw. And from there on out, it was all a blur. called back up midway through the season, Diaz was announced with a single iPhone photo and a Facebook post. However, now it was in his hands to change his own fate. So, within 3 weeks, he was sliding past Cerro Porteño's defense to score his debut goal in the Copa Sudamericana, and less than a year later, he was making his national team debut against Argentina. It hadn't even been 2 months since he had been made a regular starter at Atletico Junior, but the numbers were unquestionable. 7 goals in 7 games, scoring an 81st minute equalizer to get a comeback win in the last 32 of the Sudamericana. In fact, that call-up only made him go even harder, scoring in the first leg of the quarters, only to watch them let go of a 2-goal advantage and come back in the dying minutes with a winner yet again, even assisting one more in the semis, only to fall just short of the title on a penalty shootout. Though he'd still have plenty of time to score the opener in the final of the Colombian Championship, so he could at least wipe his tears to a gold medal. Suddenly, he had River Plate, Zenit, and oddly enough Cardiff City coming for him, but after 6 months unable to commit to a move, it was at the advice of Radamel Falcao and James Rodriguez, now his teammates at the Copa America, that Luis Diaz finally gave his yes to FC Porto. Still, even if he did take the league and cup double on his debut season while steadily racking up 14 goals, just 5 shy of the team's top scorer, he was still far from a guaranteed starter, and honestly, it seems almost criminal how long it took Porto to put him at the center of that team. I mean, just 4 matches into his second season, not only had he assisted an equalizer against Sporting, but he had showed up to a match against Man City and glided past their entire team in a Maradona-style run that led to one of the goals of the season. After just 14 starts, he was up to 14 goal contributions. However, then, due to seniority, tactical decisions, or whatever you want to call it, he got dropped harder than ever. For 3 months, while the name Luis Diaz was damn near forgotten, Porto fell short in every competition without him, and then, almost as if to rub it in their faces, over summer, just as 2 players out of the front 3 that had kept him out left the club basically for free, Diaz scored a bicycle kick in his first start in the Copa America against Brazil, then 2 matches later an equalizer in the semis versus Argentina, only missing out on the final over a penalty shootout and still coming back and scoring a brace with a 94th minute winner to secure the bronze medal, as well as the golden boot alongside Lionel Messi. After that, the results came faster than anyone could have imagined. By January, Diaz was already on 21 goal contributions, had been named the league's player of the month twice, not losing a single league match and getting within a single goal of the league's top scorer, despite being a winger who never took any penalties. Even in the Champions League, he managed to score home and away against AC Milan. Yet, with Porto having lost so many players for basically no money over the previous transfer markets and now having FFP coming after them, it all felt bittersweet because they knew they had no choice but to sell him in the winter market. So, even though their original plan had been to wait until the summer when they'd be able to slowly introduce him into the team, once Tottenham made the move, Liverpool had to swoop in before it was too late, and that was the best decision they could have made. It's actually hard to convey how rapidly Diaz adapted to the Premier League, but let's just say this, the fact that 27 days after his arrival he was already lighting up a cup final and lifting a trophy is far from the most impressive part. In fact, just 2 weeks after that against Brighton, in what was his first full 90 for the club, he was already scoring and taking the Man of the Match award, as the commentators claimed they had not seen a player adapt as easily to a club mid-season since Eddie Cantona. Suddenly, he was already scoring and assisting in the Champions League quarter-finals against none other than Benfica, whose fans booed him all night to no effect whatsoever. So much so that by April, after scoring and assisting against United, he was already getting back to the Champions League, coming off the bench with Liverpool tied on aggregate in the semi-finals, and flipping the game on its head, even scoring one himself to put them in the final. As journalists began asking Klopp what level he could reach, and the manager simply replied, "The top of the world. He's a world-class player." Suddenly, with all the titles on the line, it somehow already felt like instead of Diaz having to prove himself to be at Liverpool's level, he was the one desperately trying to raise the bar, as even with his goal against Tottenham the following game, they'd settle for a draw, losing out on the league title by a single point. Not to mention that then, in the FA Cup final, it had to be him who once again lit up Chelsea, taking the man of the match as they narrowly clinched that trophy, and maybe the most painful of all, as they'd lose the Champions League final to Real by a single goal. Though, really, that pain would not be the heaviest cross he'd have to bear at Liverpool. Having already raised the bar on the second match day of the following season with an unbelievable solo goal to equalize against Palace, before putting down a brace for the biggest win in the club's history, then Diaz blew out his knee. 6 whole months out, effectively delaying what would have been his first full season at the club for another year, and it wasn't over. As the fans held their breath in anticipation, waiting to see how Diaz would recover from his injury, if he could truly replace Mane and whether he'd still reach that extra level promised by Klopp, he started the season with a goal against Chelsea as well as an acrobatic volley versus Bournemouth in the first 2 games. However, just as every journalist had begun sketching out articles about what this season could bring for him, another set of news arrived. All the way out in Colombia, his father had been kidnapped. And somehow, even then, while his father was being transported on a mule through the Venezuelan rainforest, Diaz came on the pitch with 7 minutes left as Liverpool were down 1-0 to Luton Town and scored the equalizer before exposing a t-shirt with the message, "Libertad para papá." In fact, maybe even more impressively, after the terrorist organization who had first been accused of the kidnapping ended up getting his father back from the actual captors and handing him back to the police after 13 days of captivity, with Diaz having to face the Brazilian national team in Colombia that same week, he scored the brace to hand his country their first win over the Brazilians in 80 years, pointing to his father in celebration as the old man damn near collapsed in tears in the stands. But though, in that second half of the season, he'd still managed to get 12 goal contributions, scoring against Arsenal as well as a goal that put them in the League Cup final, putting down maybe his best performance to date against who else but Chelsea again, and even getting an acrobatic goal against United. Well, then, with Klopp leaving the club and already rumors of a possible exit for Diaz himself brewing up, as those fabled contract negotiations stalled for the first time and City came in, trying to see how they could profit from it, you almost got the sense that, through one misfortune or another, we had already been robbed of ever seeing Diaz reach his final form. And maybe that was what led Slot to make the mistakes he would make. Still, even if under an all-new manager, Diaz opened with 6 goal contributions in 6 matches, including the goal of the month in a brace against Man United, which may have been why the moment Liverpool was hit with an injury crisis, he was the one Slot looked towards to fill in the striker role. Now, obviously, playing out of position is about the least optimal scenario for any player. However, in this case in particular, I think it actually brought in something positive for Diaz. Let's not even mention the fact that he somehow scored the Champions League hat-trick in his first match as a striker. The actual best thing that came from this was that for 4 months he was put into specialized finishing and box movement practice, meaning that by the end, even once he had been brought back to the left wing, he was scoring at a higher rate than he ever had since joining the club. Not to mention that he had been the most clutch player in the team from the moment that Liverpool's form started to falter and his team began dropping points. In other words, I genuinely believe that short period for which he played as a striker enabled him to finally take that last step into becoming the player he had always been destined to be. The thing is, unfortunately for Liverpool, others became aware of this much sooner than they did. With Muller out of the MLS, Sané moving to Galatasaray, Coman to the Saudi Pro League and Musiala injured, once Bayern lost out on the possible signings of Wirtz and Nico Williams, it felt like they had to pull off some transfer market miracle in order to salvage their squad, but instead, they just made Luis Diaz their 3rd most expensive signing of all time. And if you think that he had adjusted quickly to new leagues in the past, this was a whole new level. Suddenly, as Diaz got sent off 45 minutes into a match against PSG, not only had he already bagged the brace, but he had brought his season's tally up to 15 goal contributions, even though we were only 4 days into the month of November. In fact, only another 4 days after that, from an impossible angle, he had scored the goal of the year as well. But the best of all was that this time, unlike every other time in his career, this had not been any sort of purple patch. Diaz carried out this same form throughout the whole season. So much so that just a week after his first Bundesliga hat-trick, an assist against Werder Bremen meant he had hit 31 goal contributions, matching his best every year, though we were still in February with the Champions League knockout stage yet to start. And that's where he played at his best. Having already made a goal and 2 assists against Atalanta in the last 16 look effortless, Diaz stepped up to the Bernabeu and opened the scoring within 41 minutes to give Bayern their first win at Real Madrid Stadium since 2001. Then, for good measure, once Real brought it back to 4-4 on aggregate, he showed back up in the last minute of the second leg with a screamer to send Mbappe and company home. However, if that 7-goal thriller felt unreal, then, after a short stop in order to secure 2 assists in a game that brought Bayern the Bundesliga title, as well as a goal to put them in the German Cup final, Diaz came back for the semi-final against PSG. And 1 hour in, with PSG already leading 5-2 and in everyone's eyes already with 1 foot in the final, first, Upamecano scored to reduce their disadvantage, and then, with a long ball coming his way, Diaz took 1 perfect touch, dummied the defender, dragged it, and smacked it in. One of the goals of the season, the cherry on top in maybe the best match of the decade, as well as his 26th goal of the season, making his tally already higher than what Robben or Ribéry had ever managed at the club. Sure, they ended up missing the final regardless, but I doubt that made losing Diaz much easier on the heart of any Liverpool fan.